that we're all seeking. We want to live long and we want to live healthy. But the enemy of longevity is actually chronic disease. And the types of diseases that I'm talking about are things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, dementia, inflammation in general, long COVID, cancer. These are the types of things that can sink your ability to have a long and fruitful life. And it's interesting because these are the risk factors that put people with COVID into the hospital and make these people sicker. People with heart disease, diabetes, obesity, they're going to have a harder time with SARS-CoV-2. I find it really interesting that chronic disease is actually hurting us in terms of the population in more than one way. All of these diseases have something in common. They are all emblematic of mitochondrial dysfunction, the powerhouse of the cell. Inside of most of your cells, there's these little organelles called mitochondria, and they burn fuel in the form of glucose, fats, proteins to make energy and carbon dioxide. And just like an engine in your car, which makes locomotion and needs a good cooling system, otherwise the engine will become inefficient and shut down, the mitochondria also makes heat in the form of something called oxidative stress. Now, if that oxidative stress is out of control, it's going to make your mitochondria less efficient, and it's going to make less energy, and it's going to cause problems and diseases. And it's those diseases that cause mitochondrial dysfunction. But scientists are finding out that melatonin is a substance that is made on site. It's sort of like a cooling system, and that the higher the levels of melatonin, the less oxidative stress that you have. In fact, melatonin is a cooling system that allows your mitochondria to work more efficiently. Those of you that have been following us here on MedCram know that there's been exciting research that shows that there may be a way to actually improve melatonin in your cells. That melatonin is what? It's something that doesn't require a supply chain. It's something that's free. You just have to go outside and get it. And I think this is really important, especially when we talk about pandemics, because supply chains can be hurt by pandemics. That's right, it's sun, but not just any portion of the sun. Specifically, red light and near-infrared light is now being shown scientifically to have an effect on the mitochondria, that it tends to produce melatonin, which is the most powerful antioxidant actually in the human body. It's even more powerful than glutathione. Here's an excerpt from a paper by Russell Ryder and Scott Zimmerman that was published in 2019, ironically 1 year before the pandemic. They say here, it has now been shown that the mitochondria produce melatonin in many cells in quantities which are orders of magnitude higher than is produced in the pineal gland. This subcellular melatonin does not necessarily fluctuate with our circadian clock or release into the circulation system, but instead has been proposed to be consumed locally in response to the free radical density within each cell, in particular in response to near-infrared light exposure. Now, this is important to understand because infrared light is something that you can't see. It's beyond the spectrum of red, just like ultraviolet is on the other end, the high frequency end, beyond purple. So think of this as a keyboard. There are certain frequencies that you can't hear above the highest point and below which the lowest point. Well, this is the same sort of thing with infrared light. We need to have this light be able to penetrate. How is this going to happen? The type of area that we're talking about is this area down here in the red to infrared light. And this can penetrate solid objects better than this other type of light up here. If it doesn't, it's not going to get to that mitochondria. Let me show you again here what I'm talking about. This is a photograph given to me by Robert Fosbury, who's an astrophysicist at the European Space Agency. He's got a near-infrared light source behind his hand and a near-infrared filter in front of his hand, actually photographing this. As you can see, these photons of light can actually literally pass right through the entire hand. And you may notice something here. There's something missing that you would expect to see here. What you're missing is bone. This type of light can actually penetrate through bone. It's kind of like when you pull up to a stop sign and there's another car there and it's playing its really loud music. What you're hearing mostly is the low frequency sounds, and that's exactly what infrared and red light is in the visual spectrum in this case, is that it's very low frequency light and it's able to penetrate through solid objects. It can penetrate deeply into your body and stimulate the mitochondria to make melatonin. This is what they are actually finding out. The other thing that's really interesting about this as well is that infrared light happens to be something that is reflected highly in grass and leaves of trees. This is an infrared filter, once again, from Bob Fosbury, showing a lot of reflectivity here in terms of the trees, the grass. Notice that the water is very dark, and that's going to become important because water seems to be the great absorber of infrared light. So let's review again. We got near-infrared light that's coming in, and it's penetrating through the skin, and it's scattering, going to the mitochondria, and there it's making it more efficient. It's cooling the engine down, making it more efficient, less likely to seize, so we get less oxidative stress. We get more output from the engine. That means more ATP. That's the energy that comes out of the mitochondria. There's more metabolism occurring, so a higher production of carbon dioxide, and because it's using fuel, you're going to get lower blood glucose. Is there actually evidence for this? This is from Glenn Jeffries' lab, where they took 30 students and they exposed them to 75 grams of glucose. In a randomized controlled trial without them knowing, on their back, they exposed them to red light from 15 minutes versus placebo, just on their back, about a 2-foot by 2-foot section. And they found that there was a 27% reduction of glucose in the blood. And they said, wow, what's causing this? And they checked on those subjects for exhaled carbon dioxide, and it was higher in these subjects that had lower glucose. If the mitochondria seems to be the place where this is happening, the tissue in the body with the highest amount of mitochondria is the retina. And that makes sense because there's a lot of transportation there of signals going on in the retina. It's highly metabolically active. This goes along with the mitochondrial theory of aging, which is that after about 40 years, there's about a 70% decline in ATP production, leading to visual problems in the elderly. Well, they did an experiment where they took elderly people and they exposed them in the morning to red light for about 3 minutes, and that was enough to rejuvenate the mitochondria so that for a week, there was a 17% improvement in visual acuity. Again, this was published out of Glenn Jeffries' lab, and it was in a randomized controlled trial. What about some other data? This is a great study that was done at Oxford where they took people to give blood tests, and in the previous 7 days of drawing that blood, they found that every single hour of increased sun, not temperature, but sunlight, led to improved insulin sensitivity and decreased triglycerides. This wasn't like sun led to more exercise outside, and that's what did it, because it was not based on temperature. And the things that get you outside is not just sun, but also temperature. If you want to get even bigger than that, this is a study that was done in Sweden, published at the Karolinska University Hospital. 30,000 people, 20-year follow-up, massive study, published in March of 2016. And they divided these people here into 3 groups: those that avoided the sun, those that had moderate sun, and that had most active sun exposure. And you can see here that cardiovascular disease went down as sun exposure went up. Cancer death rates went down, and other non-cardiovascular death went down. In other words, there was a dose-response curve. Now, this study was repeated again in the UK with 10 times the number of people, and they found exactly the same results. 300,000 people. Follow-up showed that as well. So it should make sense that if you're getting outside and you're getting near-infrared light, that getting out into green spaces should do that, because we just explained that green spaces reflect infrared light. And they found this exactly the same thing. This is the University of East Anglia in the UK, meta-analysis of over 140 studies showing that the benefits of the great outdoors was that for diabetes, there was a 28% reduction in incidence. Cardiovascular mortality dropped by 16%. Overall mortality decreased as well. And they said in the paper, we found that spending time in or living close to natural green spaces is associated with diverse and significant health benefits. It reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, premature death, and preterm birth, and increases sleep duration. People living closer to nature also had reduced diastolic blood pressure, heart rate, and stress. In fact, one of the really interesting things we found is that exposure to green space significantly reduces people's levels of salivary cortisol, a physiological marker of stress. The data seems to be overwhelming, such to the point that even the dermatologists in August of 2024 in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology are saying maybe it's time for a rethink. That a number of societies have made statements recognizing that sunlight has beneficial effects that should be considered in formulating policy on sunlight exposure and highlighting the necessity of carrying out further research in these beneficial effects. We should take note. And I tell you, I did take note. And you're probably